Chapter 16. We found Denver at last. We kind of came at it roundabout, walking from the south along the Cherry Creek. As we got closer and closer to the mountains, I finally started fearing for my enterprise. Here we was with them Rockies poking up to high heaven, nearly atop of us, and we hadn't come across anything like the amount of wagon traffic I'd been expecting. I'd begun to wonder if this boom town of Denver truly existed, not knowing then that all the movement into the place was coming from the north of us, out of St. Joseph, along pieces of the Oregon Trail and the South Platte River. Meanwhile, Emmett enjoyed Lizzie walking left flank with him those last few days. It had taken him longer to sweeten up to her than with most people. Not that he barked or growled or anything of that nature. It was more like he was just keeping his distance. Maybe deep in his doggy brain, he connected her with that plague of grasshoppers he cowered under in some shame back on the flat plains. Once he decided there wouldn't be no more hoppers, though, he took to her training with energy. "Emmett," I heard Lizzie scold more than once, "you needn't nip at my heels. I can see that silly hen wandering off as well as you can." I'd set Lizzie to walking the birds as a part of our deal about treating her the same as a normal person. It was a lesser of two evils as I saw it. Jabez, after he'd figured Lizzie and me was on comfortable terms again, had fixed his mind on training her to hunt with him. "No way on this earth!" I squelched that one fast. I was still in charge, wasn't I? "Why not, Simon? Hunting's a useful skill, and I got the feeling Lizzie would take real fine to a rifle." "That might be so, and then again it mightn't." I stared Jabez down. "Not that you've bagged anything more tasty than jackrabbits and rattlers lately. I'm getting mighty tired of rabbit and rattler stew." "I can't shoot what ain't there, Simon. You knows that as well as me." He stared dejectedly around the rising foothills. "Unless you have a sudden taste for coyotes. They got them a bird last night." "What? You didn't tell me about that?" Jabez scowled. "Felt too awful about it. There I was, stacked out in the middle of the flock's nesting ground, and I never heard a thing. Not a solitary howl." "That's because you never hear nothing when you're sacked out, Jabez. Could be an entire army of wolves and coyotes coming through." I stopped. No point in rubbing it in any more. The losing, with us so close to Denver and Market, was bad enough. "How do you know, anyhow?" "Found the empty nest this morning with some speckles of blood. I tracked the trail of blood into the grass." He felt in his back pocket. "Here. It's all that's left." I accepted the handful of shiny feathers and held them up to the sun. They was still a pretty bronze green. "Maybe we'd better take turns keeping watch again tonight." "Maybe we'd better." But it worked out we didn't have to keep watch on account of coyotes that night. Not the animal kind, at any rate. That was because that night we ended up in Denver. Leastways on a rise outside of it. The town was set on the flats below, directly to either side of where the Cherry Creek flowed into the South Platte. And Denver was already almost as big as Jefferson City. We was all a little amazed as we settled the flock a final time. Here was the place we'd come for, right out of the blue. And we'd made it, with us and most of the birds intact. Mr. Peace had decreed the campsite just safely outside the town, still on the high plains with the Rocky Mountains another few miles to the west. "We got to be on our guard from here on in, Simon," he said, as he kept an eagle eye on where the birds was bedding down. "So as not to be gulled?" I asked. "Gulled or worse." He took his time ungearing the mules. "We got to check out the inhabitants, work out a strategy. Won't be long before they spot the birds." I glanced up from where he was working. Sure enough, people was already wandering out from the town to gawk at us. Mr. Peace noticed them and that familiar hungry look, too. "Jabeth," he called, "think it's time to break out the arsenal." "The rifles?" Jabeth popped up. "Yes, sir, Mr. Peace." When I got to saunter into Denver at long last, I was taken aback all over again at how much like a city it looked. All laid out in neat squares it was, next to those two flowing strips of water. Day was fading fast, and as there weren't any lamplights to mention, I kind of hurried along with my survey through the dusty streets. There was First Street, directly next to a bend of the South Platte River, and Front Street sidling up to Cherry Creek, with a wooden bridge to cross it. There was also a ferry to get to the other side of the Platte, and two churches, Methodist and Episcopal, which denominations seemed to have gotten here first, and rows of wooden buildings with painted signs and false fronts to make them more impressive. Wasn't an ounce of gold dust littering any of those streets, though, the way Mr. Buffy had claimed way back in Missouri. Even in the twilight, gold dust would have been hard to miss. That wasn't any big disappointment. I figured the gold would be more likely lurking in them fake-fronted establishments, in the hands of their proprietors. Nobody in Missouri had ever met up with a prospector that had returned with anything but more calluses on his hands. So I took note right off of the provisioners, them that mine the miners. Next I registered a bank, and a land office, and a newspaper office, and the express company. That express company, the Central Overland, California and Pikes Peak, had a big schedule posted out front. Couldn't believe my eyes when I read that their stagecoaches took both passengers and mail to and from Missouri every single day. More or less satisfied, I ignored the saloons that was livening up for the night and headed on back to camp. I'd been worrying some about how to get a letter and money back to Miss Rogers once my birds was sold, not to mention my debt to Uncle Lucas and Aunt Maybelle and the cousins. I hadn't thought of them in quite a while. Hadn't needed to. Wouldn't they be some kind of surprise when I came through the way I promised? But the flock wasn't sold yet. Far from it. There was no point whatsoever in putting the cart before the horse, not till the deed was done. Still, a genuine idea started growing in my head on the way back. Something Lizzie might be a help with. After breakfast the next morning, I sent Mr. Peace into Denver for a few supplies and arrangements I figured we might be needing for my idea to work. Also, to get a feeling for the lay of the land himself. Bidwell Peace wasn't no bird brain any way you looked at it, and I'd value his opinion added to mine. I sent Lizzie with him, too. She'd been jumpy with excitement over getting to see some civilization at long last, and I'd have to start trusting her out of my sight sooner or later. In the meantime, there was the turkeys to deal with. They'd gotten up bright and early like usual and started eyeing them mountains in the near distance, as if they was more than game to take them on. I felt a little bad they wouldn't be getting a close look at the snow atop them Rockies, or China somewheres to the other side. In the here and now, howsoever, I had to convince them to stick around for a little enforced rest. "Jabeth?" "I'm right here, Simon." Well, he was and he wasn't. Lizzie's herb tea hadn't seemed to waken him much this morning. Maybe that's on account of the fact that he'd spent a good piece of the night patrolling our camp with his favorite rifle, to make up for that coyote the night before. He was still hanging on to that rifle, stuck butt into the ground, maybe more like using it to prop him up. "Might as well retire the weapon for now, Jabeth. We got to break out some corn for the birds before they decides to take on mountain climbing." "When do I get to see Denver, Simon? I got me an urge just as big as Lizzie's." "Soon," I promised. "Real soon, I hope." Mr. Peace and Lizzie finally came back with a fresh supply of coffee beans. Mr. Peace set down the small sack reverently. "Any idea what they're charging for food?" For these here beans, you'd think they was gold." I didn't pay any mind to the man's grumbling. I was busy snatching at the sheet of paper that had been fluttering from Lizzie's hands. "Mr. Peace thought you'd like a copy, as a sort of souvenir." She smiled. "They're being delivered to every business in town, and most of the houses, too. Just the way you wanted it, Simon. Watch out for the ink. It's still damp." Too late. I transferred a black smudge from my fingers to my pants. Then I smiled. "It turned out right nice, Lizzie. I knew you had a way with words." "They weren't all my words, Simon. Some were yours." "But it was your idea from the start, Lizzie. These handbills." "But you're the one who knew newspaper offices did job work on the side, Simon." "What you got there?" Jabez struggled up from where he'd been napping in the shade of the wagon. "What'd I miss?" "Only the final touch to our journey." I poked the sheet in front of his nose. "The Rocky Mountain News has a real nice way with print." Jabez frowned. "You know I can't read, Simon." "You can't read?" I stared at him dumbfounded. "I never knew that. Why, even I can read, Jabez. What's the matter with you?" "The matter is that nobody ever taught me. You think they got pretty little schoolhouses with pretty little school teachers like your Miss Rogers for slaves?" "But you ain't a slave no more, Jabez. Not nohow." "Still can't read, can I?" Well. "Read it for him now, Simon," Lizzie broke in. "And I can teach Jabez how to read later. You can help me." "Later? What later?" I wondered to myself, but I didn't let on. "I can. I mean, sure and certain." I squared the damp sheet before my eyes. I cleared my throat. Lucky I already knew what it said, or my performance might have left something to be desired. "Auction. High noon tomorrow by the Central City Wall. The great turkeys of the Great Turkey Walk. Straight from Missouri, the finest, fattest, tenderest turkeys you ever set eyes on or will ever sink your teeth into. They have arrived in Denver. Accept no imitations. Bronze turkeys are the best. No scrip or shin plasters taken in payment. Gold coin only. Simon Green, proprietor of the flock. Bidwell Peace, auctioneer. Jabez Ballou and Elizabeth Hardwick, facilitators." Jabez's brow wrinkled. "Mighty nice of you to put my name in print, Simon, but what in this wide world is a facilitator?" I turned to Lizzie. "Why don't you do the explaining, it being your word choice, same as that no-good paper money, the shin plaster business, was Mr. Peace's contribution?" Lizzie shrugged. "A facilitator is someone who helps the process along the way, Jabez, like you did by hunting and keeping everyone fed. I told Simon my name didn't belong there, next to yours, when you helped so much, but he insisted." Jabez graciously waved away Lizzie's protest. "No matter. I never been called a facilitator before. It's a mighty fancy way of putting things. Mighty impressive." He shook the last traces of sleep from his body, and his shoulders took on their old jaunty swing. "Maybe I'll just go facilitate us a pot of fresh coffee." Mr. Peace grinned at his back. "Good idea, Jabez. Then we can all commence to making a proper count of our flock for tomorrow's auction." I stared at Mr. Peace. That was the first time on the entire trip that he'd referred to the birds as ours. It made me feel good that everybody was truly getting excited about my enterprise the way they was. Too bad it was here at the very end of the line. Too bad we was all going to be broke up the same as my flock come noon tomorrow. End of chapter 16.